Hidden deep within a sweeping valley shielded by rolling hills and ancient forests, lay a village that seemed untouched by time. Stone cottages with thatched roofs lined the cobbled streets, and a single winding river sliced through the center like a silver ribbon. The villagers spoke in low tones, their words often laced with old sayings and superstitions passed down through generations. It was a place where the old ways reigned supreme, where modern inventions were viewed with suspicion, and where change was a stranger unwelcome at the door. In this isolated pocket of the world, tradition was not just respected, it was law. Each family adhered to the ancient codes etched into their hearts by the relentless passing of time. These customs were as firm as the oak trees rooted in the village square, their strength drawn from centuries of unchallenged authority. Elders made decisions not just for their families, but for the entire community, and the younger generations were expected to obey without question. The rhythm of life in the village moved predictably: birth, childhood, adolescence, marriage, work, parenthood, and death. Deviating from this path was unthinkable. Those who dared to challenge the old ways either left in shame or lived in quiet resentment, forced into a mold that fit them poorly. Gossip served as a warning system, ensuring that anyone tempted to stray from their duties was quickly pulled back into line by public scrutiny and whispered condemnations. Nowhere was this more evident than in the treatment of women. From the moment a girl could walk, she was taught that her ultimate purpose was to marry and bear children. Her education was limited to domestic skills: cooking, cleaning, sewing, and obedience. Dreams of adventure, of education, of a life outside the village borders, were quashed with gentle smiles and firm hands. A good wife is the jewel of the home, the elders often said, a phrase repeated so often that it seemed to seep into the very stones of the houses themselves. Marriages were not so much unions of love as they were transactions, deals struck between families to strengthen alliances, settle debts, or maintain appearances. Love was a luxury few could afford. If a match was deemed advantageous, the young woman's opinion mattered little. Her consent was assumed, her protests brushed aside like dust on a windowsill. To refuse was to shame her family, to invite scandal, and to risk being cast out, alone and destitute. It was into this world that Eliza was born, a girl with bright eyes and a mind too curious for her own good. She often dreamed of the world beyond the hills, of cities filled with dazzling lights and streets teeming with possibility. But dreams were dangerous things in the village. Dreams led to discontent, and discontent was the seed of rebellion. So Eliza learned to hide her ambitions behind polite smiles and lowered eyes, all while nurturing a quiet flame of hope deep within her heart. The village itself was beautiful, almost deceptively so. In the spring, fields of wildflowers painted the meadows in bursts of color. In the fall, the harvest festivals brought laughter and song, and bonfires lit the starry skies. Outsiders who stumbled upon the village might have mistaken it for a quaint paradise, a charming relic of a simpler time. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of fear of change, fear of dishonor, fear of the consequences of defying tradition. For generations, the village maintained a fragile balance, carefully tending its customs like one tends a precious but dangerous flame. No one dared to question the elders' decisions, and no one dared to imagine that life could be different. That is, until one fateful night, when a forced marriage and an unexpected revelation would shatter the village's delicate equilibrium and thrust it into the harsh light of change. The story of that night would travel far beyond the valley, carried on the lips of traders, wanderers, and even reporters. It would make headlines, stirring outrage and sympathy in places the villagers had never even heard of. It would mark the beginning of the end for the old ways and the dawn of a new, uncertain era. But before all that, before the scandal, before the headlines, before the world outside came rushing in, there was just a girl named Eliza, a village frozen in time, and a future that no one could have foreseen.
Eliza was born on a misty spring morning, when the village fields were carpeted in wildflowers and the air smelled of damp earth and fresh beginnings. Her mother, Marianne, swore that the moment she held Eliza in her arms, she knew her daughter was different. She had the brightest eyes anyone had ever seen, eyes the color of the summer sky, and a gaze that seemed to drink in the world around her, hungry for understanding. As a child, Eliza was full of questions that startled and, at times, unsettled the adults around her. Why did only boys get to go hunting? Why did the women always walk behind the men at festivals? Why couldn't she visit the city beyond the hills where the lights were rumored to shine all night long? Each question was met with a gentle smile and a vague answer, but the message was always the same: this is just the way things are. Unlike some of the other village girls, who dutifully practiced their stitching and learned the subtle arts of deference, Eliza's spirit was wild and irrepressible. She spent her mornings racing the wind across the fields, her hair flying behind her like a banner of defiance. She would crouch by the river for hours, building tiny boats from leaves and twigs, sending them off on adventures she could only imagine. Yet as much as she dreamed of another life, Eliza was not reckless. She loved her family fiercely and understood the weight of their expectations. Her father, Thomas, was a kind, stoic man whose weathered hands bore the marks of a lifetime of toil. He had a deep, booming laugh that rarely surfaced but, when it did, made the walls of their cottage tremble. Her mother, Marianne, was gentler but no less strong. She stitched love into every meal she prepared and every garment she mended, and though she rarely spoke of her own dreams, Eliza sometimes caught a flicker of wistfulness in her eyes. Eliza was the eldest of 3 children. Her younger brothers, Peter and Jonah, idolized her, following her like shadows on sunny afternoons. She taught them how to climb the tallest trees, how to find the juiciest berries, and how to skip stones across the river. Their laughter was the soundtrack of her youth, a bright, bubbling thing that filled her with both joy and an aching sort of sadness she couldn't name. The older she grew, the more Eliza felt the invisible walls of the village closing in around her. It wasn't immediate, it was a slow tightening, like a rope pulling taut. At first, it was the subtle shift in how the adults spoke to her, no longer indulging her wild stories or her questions about the world beyond. Then it was the lessons she was forced to attend, where older women taught her how to be a good wife, how to cook the perfect stew, how to clean a house until it gleamed, how to lower her eyes respectfully when a man spoke. Eliza hated these lessons. They felt like a slow erasure of the girl she had been, the fierce, curious child who had once imagined herself sailing away on a river of stars. But she endured them, because to resist openly would have shamed her parents. And she loved them too much to bring that upon them. There were moments, in the quiet of the night, when Eliza allowed herself to dream. Lying on the narrow bed she shared with her sister until marriage, she would stare at the beams of the ceiling and imagine a different life. A life where she could choose her own path, speak her mind without fear, see the wonders that lay beyond the hills. She imagined standing in a city square surrounded by buildings that scraped the sky, or sailing on a ship across endless oceans. But morning always came too soon, and with it the crushing reality that her fate was not her own to decide. The villagers spoke often about duty, how it was the glue that held their fragile society together. A woman's duty was to marry, to bear children, to support her husband. Anything else was selfishness, a threat to the very fabric of their way of life. And though Eliza's heart rebelled against this, she carried the guilt of even thinking such thoughts. Who was she to place her own desires above the needs of her family, of her community? The struggle between duty and desire raged quietly within her. She became adept at masking her true feelings, presenting a dutiful facade to the world while keeping her secret dreams hidden in the deepest part of her heart. Outwardly, she was the perfect daughter, polite, obedient, skilled in all the tasks expected of a young woman preparing for marriage. Inwardly, she was a storm barely held in check. Her parents, for their part, loved her too deeply to be blind to her unhappiness. They saw the flicker of longing in her eyes, the way she would linger at the edge of the village and stare out toward the hills as if they held the answers to her silent questions. But they were products of the same traditions, bound by the same invisible chains. Even if they had wanted to encourage her dreams, and perhaps, deep down, they were powerless to do so. To allow Eliza to stray from the accepted path would not only risk her future but their standing within the village. And so they pressed her gently, lovingly, back into the mold she was expected to fit. It was this complicated love, both a comfort and a cage, that defined Eliza's early years. She never doubted that her parents cared for her. But love, in the village, was not freedom. It was duty. It was sacrifice. As she approached her 17th birthday, the whispers began. Suitors would soon come calling, and it would be her turn to accept the life prepared for her. There would be no escape, no sudden miracle to deliver her from the fate she had long dreaded. The only question that remained was who she would be bound to, and whether she could find a way to survive the life that awaited her without losing herself entirely. Little did Eliza know that her life was about to take a turn no one could have predicted, a turn that would force her to choose between submission and rebellion, between the village's traditions and her own fragile hopes. A turn that would thrust her into the center of a story that would shake the village to its very core.
If Eliza was the village's brightest hope, then Samuel was its most visible shame. His name was uttered in hushed tones, usually accompanied by a cluck of the tongue or a shake of the head. Children were warned that if they disobeyed their parents or strayed from the path, they might end up like Samuel, lost, broken, and forever an object of pity and ridicule. Samuel had not always been the village drunk. Once, many years ago, he had been Samuel the proud, Samuel the brave, the boy with a quick smile and quicker feet, who could outrun anyone in the fields and charm the sternest of elders with his clever words. He had been the hope of his family, the one everyone said was destined for greatness, or at least something better than the dull, hard life most villagers endured. His father, a harsh but respected man, had pinned all his ambitions on Samuel's young shoulders. There had been talk of sending him beyond the hills for an apprenticeship, maybe even to the distant city where fortunes were made. Samuel dreamed of it too, the distant lands, the endless possibilities, a life not bound by the suffocating traditions of the village. But dreams are fragile things, easily shattered by the blunt force of reality. When Samuel was 15, disaster struck. A fire, sparked by a freak lightning storm, destroyed his family's barn and most of their crops. With no savings to recover from the loss, his family was plunged into poverty. His father, once a proud and formidable man, turned bitter and cruel, blaming Samuel for every misstep, every misfortune that followed. The apprenticeship was forgotten. The dreams were abandoned. Samuel stayed in the village, trapped by circumstances he could neither control nor escape. And slowly something inside him withered. At first, Samuel tried to fight against his fate. He took on odd jobs, toiling from dawn to dusk, trying to rebuild what had been lost. But no matter how hard he worked, the village whispered behind his back. They called him cursed. They blamed him for the fire, for his family's fall from grace. It was easier to see him as a symbol of failure than to confront the fragility of their own lives. By the time Samuel turned 20, he had begun to drown his pain the only way he knew how, with drink. It numbed the memories, dulled the sharp ache of lost potential. The first time he stumbled home drunk, the villagers tooted and shook their heads, but they were not surprised. It was as if they had been waiting for him to confirm their worst assumptions. Over the years, Samuel became a fixture of the village, a cautionary tale in human form. He was seen lurching through the streets at odd hours, muttering to himself or laughing at nothing. His once bright eyes grew glassy, his once proud bearing slouched into a permanent stoop. Children pointed and giggled. Adults averted their eyes in a mix of pity and disdain. To the villagers, Samuel was a burden they could not get rid of but also could not help. He was tolerated, fed scraps out of guilt rather than kindness, and spoken of only as an example of what could happen when one strayed from the path of duty and hard work. Yet there were layers to Samuel that few ever saw, or wanted to see. On the rare evenings when he was left alone, sitting by the river with a battered flask in his hand, the mask would sometimes slip. Those who happened upon him during these moments were often struck by the sadness that clung to him like a second skin. His drunken mutterings were not always nonsense. Often they were fragments of poetry, snatches of songs long forgotten, or philosophical musings that spoke of a mind still sharp beneath the fog of drink. The truth was that Samuel had not completely given up on life. Deep inside, buried under years of disappointment and bitterness, was a man who still burned with anger. Anger at the village that had abandoned him, at the fate that had trapped him, at himself for not finding a way out. He had learned that in a village ruled by appearances, it was easier to be dismissed as a drunk than to fight a losing battle against judgment and cruelty. If they wanted a fool, he would give them one. If they wanted someone to mock and pity, he would play the part. It was a bitter form of rebellion, a refusal to give the villagers the satisfaction of seeing him broken on their terms. There were even rumors, quiet ones dismissed as nonsense by most, that Samuel wasn't nearly as drunk as he appeared. Some said they had seen him walk straight and speak clearly when he thought no one was looking. Others claimed he had a secret stash of books hidden away in the abandoned mill on the edge of the village, books filled with knowledge far beyond the simple tales taught to village children. But rumors were easy to ignore. Easier than confronting the possibility that the village's scapegoat was more complicated, and more dangerous, than they had believed. As for Samuel, he watched the village with weary eyes, biding his time. He had learned patience from his long years of exile. He had learned that sometimes the best way to topple a rotten structure was not to attack it head-on, but to wait for the right moment, the right spark, to send it all crashing down. And when that moment came, Samuel would be ready. The villagers thought they knew Samuel. They thought he was a harmless fool, a man broken beyond repair. They had no idea that he was the ticking clock beneath their very feet. They would find out soon enough. The decision was made, as so many were, behind closed doors and with heavy hearts. It was not a decision born of cruelty but of fear, the kind of fear that had ruled the village for generations. Fear of shame, of change, of what might happen if tradition was not obeyed to the letter. It began with a gathering of the elders, a half-dozen stooped figures with furrowed brows and calloused hands, men and women who had seen too many winters to believe in the luxury of dreams. They convened in the council hall, a drafty stone building that smelled of smoke, damp wool and old wood. Around the long table they discussed the problem of Eliza. She was 17 now, nearly 18 and unwed, a dangerous thing in a village where marriage was a duty, not a choice. It did not matter that she was still young or that her heart was untouched by love. What mattered was that her continued singleness was becoming the subject of whispered gossip. "She thinks herself too good for us," muttered one elder, a wiry woman with sharp eyes. "She dreams of leaving," added another, shaking his head. Dreams breed discontent. The solution was obvious, inevitable even. She needed to marry, and she needed to marry quickly. The village could not afford to let her example spread, could not allow other girls to start believing that they too could hold out for love or adventure. And so they looked for a match, and found Samuel. It made a twisted sort of sense. Samuel was a burden to the village, a man they all pitied but none wanted responsibility for. If he were married, he would no longer be solely the village's concern. His wife could care for him, manage him, contain him. And Eliza, with her stubborn spirit, would learn humility through hardship. She would become what they needed her to be, quiet, dutiful, resigned. Eliza's parents were summoned next. They came to the council hall with dread in their hearts, already sensing that nothing good would come from the sudden summons. When they heard the decision, Marianne wept openly, and Thomas clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. But what could they do? Defiance would mean ostracism, ruin, the destruction of their family's honor. "It is for the best," the head elder said, her voice like iron. "The girl has spirit. Samuel needs someone to guide him. This will be good for both." The word rang hollow, a cruel joke in the heavy air. That night, Eliza's parents sat her down at the kitchen table, their faces pale and drawn. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Eliza listened in stunned silence as they told her she would marry Samuel in 3 weeks' time. At first she thought it was a mistake, a cruel misunderstanding. Then the truth sank in heavy and cold as a stone. She shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "No," she whispered. "Please no. I can't." Her mother's hands trembled as she reached across the table to take Eliza's. "We have no choice, my love. They have decided. If we refuse, we will be cast out. We will lose everything." "But he's," Eliza choked on the words. "A drunk. A broken man. A living cautionary tale. And she was to be chained to him for life?" Thomas turned away, unable to meet her gaze. His silence was louder than any argument. Helplessness crashed over Eliza like a wave. There was no escape, no appeal. Her life was no longer her own. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of disbelief and dread. Preparations for the wedding began at once, as if by moving quickly, the village could pretend this was just another happy occasion. The seamstresses took her measurements with cold efficiency, discussing fabrics and trims as if Eliza were a dressmaker's dummy rather than a girl being led to her own undoing. Her wedding dress was simple, white muslin with a lace-trimmed bodice, made from cloth that her mother had hoarded for years for this very moment. It should have been a thing of joy, a symbol of new beginnings. Instead it felt like a shroud. The dowry was assembled, a modest chest of linens, a few pieces of silverware, a patchwork quilt stitched by her grandmother's hands. These were meant to smooth her transition into married life, but to Eliza, they were anchors, tying her to a fate she did not choose. The village buzzed with gossip. Women gathered at wells and market stalls, lowering their voices but making no real effort to hide their words. "Poor girl," they murmured. "Such a shame. Maybe she'll be good for him. Or maybe he'll drag her down too." Eliza heard it all. She carried the whispered pity like a burden on her back, each murmur another stone added to the weight she bore. Samuel, for his part, made no appearances. He remained tucked away in his crumbling cottage at the edge of the village, leaving Eliza to wonder if he even knew what was happening, or if he cared. Part of her hoped he would refuse, would laugh in the elders' faces, would set her free. But deep down she knew better. Samuel had long ago learned the price of defiance. Each night, Eliza lay awake, staring at the ceiling beam she had memorized as a child, trying to imagine a way out. Could she run? Where would she go? The nearest town was days away by foot, through treacherous forests and open fields where she would be an easy target for wolves, thieves, or worse. And even if she made it, what life awaited a runaway girl with no money, no protection? No, there was no escape. The day of the wedding crept closer, each sunrise another nail hammered into the coffin of her dreams. Eliza felt herself slipping away bit by bit. The bright, curious girl who had once imagined a life of adventure beyond the hills was fading into a ghost, a hollow thing dressed in white, destined to walk a path she had not chosen. The village rejoiced in its certainty, blind to the storm it was about to unleash. The morning of the wedding dawned gray and heavy, the sky sagging with low clouds that threatened rain. The village woke early, bustling with preparations. Bunting made from old scraps of cloth was strung across the main square, sagging between weathered buildings. Tables were set up outside the council hall, covered in thin white linens and platters of plain food, loaves of bread, hard cheese, cold roasted chickens. There was an air of forced festivity, as if by dressing the day up in borrowed finery, they could hide the rot beneath. Inside her family's small cottage, Eliza sat motionless on a wooden stool as her mother brushed out her hair. Each stroke was mechanical, rough with nerves. The white muslin dress hung limply from Eliza's frame, cinched at the waist with a ribbon that felt like a noose. The lace at the bodice itched her skin, but she said nothing. She felt distant from her own body, as though she were already gone and only the shell of her remained. "You look beautiful," her mother whispered, voice cracking. Eliza caught a glimpse of her mother's reflection in the cracked mirror, eyes red-rimmed, mouth trembling. It was not a lie meant to soothe, it was an apology. Outside the village was gathering. Men in their best wool coats, women in faded dresses they had worn to a dozen other weddings. Children darted between the adults, chasing each other with the wild energy of the unburdened. There was a hum of conversation, punctuated by bursts of laughter that sounded too loud, too brittle. The ceremony was to be held in the small stone church at the edge of the village, a squat, crumbling building where generations had prayed, wed, and mourned. Its heavy wooden doors stood open, the musty scent of damp stone and old wood spilling out onto the worn path. Eliza walked that path slowly, arm in arm with her father. His grip was tight, not supportive but restraining, as if he feared she might bolt. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, refusing to meet the eyes of the villagers who lined the path. Some smiled, thin, strained smiles. Others simply watched, faces blank, offering no comfort, no reprieve. At the altar stood Samuel. For the first time in years he was sober. He wore a suit that might once have been fine but now sagged on his thin frame, the cuffs frayed, the shoulders worn. His hair was combed back with an almost painful neatness, revealing a face that was gaunt and deeply lined. His eyes, however, were clear, clearer than Eliza had ever seen them. They were not kind eyes nor cruel. They were simply watchful. He said nothing as she approached, merely nodded once, sharply, when she took her place beside him. The ceremony began. The village priest, a man whose voice usually thundered through sermons about obedience and penance, spoke in a low, hurried tone. The words of union and fidelity slipped from his lips without conviction, as though he wished to be done with it quickly. There was no music, no singing. Only the shuffling of feet, the occasional cough, the whisper of the wind against the church walls. When the moment came to exchange vows, Eliza's throat nearly closed up. She forced the words out, each syllable tasting like ash. Samuel's voice was low and rough when he spoke his part, but he spoke it without hesitation. "You may kiss the bride," the priest muttered, barely audible. Samuel stepped forward but did not reach for her. He merely bowed his head slightly, a stiff, formal acknowledgement. Eliza felt a flicker of confusion, relief, fear. She stood still, heart pounding, unsure whether to be grateful or terrified. The guests clapped, a few cheers rising quickly then dying away embarrassed. The reception that followed was little more than a grim obligation. People milled about the tables, nibbling on food they barely tasted, making stilted conversation. They offered congratulations to Eliza and Samuel with wide, forced grins, their eyes sliding away as soon as politeness allowed. Eliza endured it like a prisoner standing for sentencing. Women clucked sympathetically around her, adjusting her veil, praising her bravery, whispering among themselves. Men clapped Samuel on the back with awkward too-hard slaps, muttering jokes he did not laugh at. Samuel remained eerily quiet throughout. He drank nothing, touched no food. He stood close to Eliza but not possessively, not warmly. It was as if he were guarding her, or perhaps guarding himself. As the afternoon wore on, the ominous tone deepened. The sky darkened, though the rain still held back. The wind picked up, tugging at the bunting, sending a chill through the crowd. Guests began to drift away, making their excuses, eager to retreat to the safety of their homes. Eliza's parents embraced her stiffly. Her mother wept openly now, pressing a bundle of linens into her arms, the last part of the dowry, and whispering frantic blessings. Her father said nothing, only kissed her forehead with a trembling mouth and turned away. Samuel offered his arm, formal as a suitor from a different era. Eliza hesitated for the barest moment, then placed her hand on his sleeve. His body was tense under the threadbare cloth, but he made no move to rush her. They walked together to Samuel's cottage, a small, sagging structure at the far end of the village. No one followed. No one watched. The cottage door creaked open. Samuel stepped aside, allowing Eliza to enter first. She hesitated on the threshold, glancing once over her shoulder at the village, now retreating into twilight. No rescue would come. No one would stop this. Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of smoke and something older, earth maybe or mildew. The single room was sparse. A fireplace, a rickety table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. Everything worn, patched, tired. Samuel closed the door softly behind them. The click of the latch sounded final. For a long moment, they stood in silence, 2 strangers bound by a cruel tradition neither had chosen. Eliza's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She braced herself for what was to come. But Samuel did not approach. He did not touch her. Instead, he crossed to the fireplace, kneeling to poke the embers back to life. The light flared, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. "You can take the bed," he said quietly without looking at her. His voice was hoarse but steady. "I'll sleep on the floor." Eliza stared at him, stunned into stillness. This was not the brutish wedding night she had feared. It was something else entirely, something she did not yet understand. The cottage groaned under the rising wind. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the roof in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Inside, 2 lost souls sat apart, wrapped in silence and uncertainty, the storm gathering all around them. And in the depths of that storm, a new, fragile thing began to stir, something that would soon turn the village's world upside down. The rain thickened as darkness fell, beating against the cottage in heavy sheets. The fire sputtered and hissed, its warmth doing little to chase away the heavy, uncertain air that hung between them. Eliza sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching Samuel where he crouched by the hearth. Minutes dragged by, stretched taut by tension. Every movement, every crackle of the fire, every gust of wind against the door sounded louder in the quiet. She expected, what? Violence? Crude demands? The drunken lurching she had been warned about? Her whole life, she had been told that marriage was a woman's burden to bear, her suffering part of the divine order. And married to Samuel, the village drunk, the burden would surely be heavier than most. But Samuel didn't move toward her. He didn't touch her. He didn't even look at her. He finished tending the fire, rose stiffly, and crossed to the rickety table. From underneath it, he drew out a battered bottle of whiskey. Eliza tensed, every muscle locking tight. He placed the bottle on the table. Then, with a deliberate motion, he tipped it over. The golden liquid spilled across the rough wood and onto the floor in a spreading pool. Eliza blinked, startled. Samuel watched the whiskey drain away, then turned to her, his face composed, almost grim. "I suppose," he said quietly, "you deserve the truth." She said nothing. She couldn't trust her voice not to crack. He pulled out the chair and sat down heavily, running one hand through his thinning hair. "I'm not drunk," he said. "I haven't been, not really, for years." Eliza stared at him, unable to comprehend what he was saying. It made no sense. The Samuel she had seen stumbling through the village, reeking of liquor, muttering nonsense to himself, how could that have been a lie? Samuel offered a bitter, humorless smile. "I let them think I was. It was easier. Safer." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low but clear. "I saw what this village does to people who don't fit their mold. I watched them drive out anyone who asked too many questions, who wanted more than this dying place could give. So I gave them what they wanted to see, a fool, a drunk, a man too broken to be a threat. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. You pretended? She whispered. He nodded. It kept them from fearing me. From trying to control me. They left me alone mostly. Let me rot quietly on the edge of town. He gave a small bitter laugh. Until they needed me. Eliza's mind spun. Her whole life, Samuel had been the village's cautionary tale, a living example of what happened to those who strayed from the path. And now he sat before her, sober and sharp-eyed, revealing himself not as a cautionary tale but a rebel in hiding. But why marry me? She asked, voice trembling. Samuel's expression softened, the hardness in his features giving way to something almost gentle. Because they were going to marry you off anyway, he said. If not to me, then to someone worse. He didn't have to say the names. Eliza knew. There were men in the village, older, crueler, who had sniffed around her family like wolves around a wounded deer. Men whose interest in her had made her skin crawl. I figured, Samuel continued, better me than them. I could protect you. Give you some time at least. Eliza felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She didn't know whether they were tears of relief, of anger, or something else entirely. You don't even know me, she said, the words sharp with hurt. I know enough, he said simply. I've watched you. You don't belong here. You're not like them. Silence fell again, heavy but different now. Less like a crushing weight, more like the moment before a storm breaks and clears the air. Eliza rose slowly from the bed, crossing the small room to stand across from him at the table. And what now? She asked. Samuel shrugged, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. Now, we wait. Watch. Plan. He tapped a finger against the tabletop. The elders think they've won. They think they've tamed you, and me. They'll let their guard down. He leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper. And when they do, we'll be ready. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, but it was a different rhythm now, not fear but something fiercer. Oh, they won't believe us, she said. No, Samuel agreed. Not at first. But truth has a way of digging itself out, no matter how deep they try to bury it. She studied him carefully. For the first time she saw not a broken man but a strategist, a survivor, and perhaps an ally. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cottage, something steady and defiant took root. Samuel pushed a small parcel across the table to her. Wrapped in rough cloth, it looked insignificant, but when she opened it she found a handful of documents. Old letters, ledgers, notes in a careful hand. Proof, he said, of the deals they've made, the bribes they've taken, the people they've ruined. Eliza's hands trembled as she leafed through the papers. Every page was a weapon. You kept all this? He nodded. I was waiting for the right moment. Alone I could do nothing. But with you. He didn't finish the sentence. You didn't have to. Together they might stand a chance. Eliza felt something inside her shift, a slow, deliberate turning away from the fear that had ruled her life. For the first time she saw a path not of survival but of resistance. She sat down across from Samuel, the two of them illuminated by the flickering firelight. Outside, the storm roared and battered the little cottage, but within its fragile walls an unspoken pact was forged. They would not be broken. Not tonight. Not ever. The village thought it had witnessed a tragedy, a girl forced into a life of misery with the village drunk. But what it had actually done was create the perfect storm. And soon enough it would realize its mistake. Morning arrived heavy and gray, the storm having spent itself in the night. In its place came a tense, damp silence that clung to the village like a shroud. The streets were muddy, the bunting shredded and hanging limp from its strings, the tables left abandoned in the square. It was as if the celebration had been nothing more than a bad dream, one the village wished to forget. But forgetting would not be so easy. Whispers began almost immediately. It started with small things. The baker's wife noticing Samuel walking to the well with a steady step, carrying himself with an unfamiliar clarity. The blacksmith's apprentice reporting that Samuel had refused a drink offered in jest. Little moments easy to dismiss individually but together, troubling. Then came the real spark. That morning, pinned to the heavy wooden door of the church, someone found a letter. It was unsigned, written in a careful, steady hand. It accused the village elders of corruption, of hoarding supplies meant for the poor, of manipulating marriages to control families, of driving out dissenters. It hinted that evidence existed, that more would come if change did not. Panic spread like fire through dry brush. The council convened an emergency meeting. The priest raged from the pulpit. Villagers whispered behind cupped hands, suspicion flashing in every glance. It was not just the content of the letter that frightened them, it was the knowledge that someone among them had been watching, waiting, gathering proof. And as people talked, their gazes turned, inevitably, toward Samuel and Eliza. The newlyweds kept to themselves in the days that followed, appearing only when necessary. Samuel continued his charade only just enough to maintain the thin veil of uncertainty. Eliza meanwhile moved through the village with a new, unsettling calm. She was no longer the timid girl who had wept behind her mother's skirts. She was something else now. Ardent. Sure. They were outsiders, but no longer invisible. Finally the confrontation came. It was in the square, in front of the bakery, where so many important village moments seemed to happen. The elders, faces flushed with anger and fear, cornered Samuel as he returned from fetching firewood. "You think you can slander this village?" demanded Elder Martin, a heavy-set man whose wealth was matched only by his hypocrisy. Samuel said nothing. "You dare accuse us, you worthless drunk?" sneered another, eyes darting to the growing crowd that was gathering eager for blood, or answers. Still Samuel was silent. It was Eliza who stepped forward. "He's not drunk," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "He hasn't been for years." A ripple moved through the onlookers, shock and confusion mixing in their faces. Samuel finally spoke then, his voice steady, cold. "You all were happy to believe the lie. It made you feel better about yourselves, didn't it? Better to think of me as a warning than as a witness." The elders blustered, tried to shout him down, but Samuel raised his hand, and to everyone's surprise they fell silent. "You think you own this village? That no one sees the deals you make in the dark, the favors exchanged, the punishments handed out to anyone who dreams of a different life?" He turned slowly, addressing not just the council but everyone within earshot. "You think you can silence dissent with fear, with arranged marriages, with exile?" He looked at Eliza and she nodded almost imperceptibly. "But we're done being afraid." From beneath his coat, Samuel produced a small bundle of papers, copies of the documents he and Eliza had pored over during long whispered nights. He tossed them at the elders' feet, the pages scattering in the mud. "Read them," he said. "Learn the truth you've tried to bury." The village erupted into chaos. Some people shouted, demanding explanations. Others grabbed the papers, reading aloud accusations of theft, bribery and worse. Fights broke out. Old grievances, long simmering, exploded into the open. In the center of it all, Samuel and Eliza stood together, silent and unyielding. That night, the village boiled with unrest. Families locked their doors. Neighbors accused neighbors. The power the elders had once wielded with an iron fist slipped from their grasp like water through cracked fingers. But within Eliza, the turmoil was even greater. In the quiet of the cottage, she sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Samuel moved around the small space, gathering supplies, speaking in low, urgent tones about what came next, how they might need to leave, how they might finally be free. But Eliza barely heard him. Betrayal and relief warred within her. She thought of the years spent fearing Samuel, the cruelty she had expected, the lies she had believed. She thought of the future she had resigned herself to, the slow suffocation of life under someone else's rule. He had lied to her, yes. He had played a part. But in doing so, he had given her a chance she never would have had otherwise. She did not love him, not yet, maybe not ever. But she owed him her freedom. And herself even more. "I don't know what happens next," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. Samuel looked up, meeting her eyes across the room. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But it's ours to choose." Eliza nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle into her bones. For the first time in her life, the path before her was not carved by tradition or fear. It was rough, uncertain, dangerous. But it was hers. And that, she realized, was worth everything. The days that followed the scandal were a strange, volatile mixture of fear and possibility. The elders tried to salvage what little authority they could, huddling together behind closed doors, whispering of punishments, threats, old ways reasserted. But the damage had been done. Their grip was weakened, and for the first time, a crack of light showed through the heavy door of tradition. It was Eliza who realized what had to happen next. She could not leave the village, not yet. She could not turn away and let the old ways slither back into place as soon as the noise faded. If real change was to come, someone had to name the truth aloud. Someone had to break the silence that had protected cruelty for generations. That someone had to be her. She told Samuel her plan one evening as they sat at their small table, the fire low and the wind moaning outside. "They'll try to stop you," he warned, his face lined with worry. "I know," she said. "But if I don't speak, everything we've done will crumble." Samuel looked at her long and hard, then gave a single solemn nod. Then I'll stand with you. The next morning, Eliza dressed not in mourning black, nor in the bright, cheerful colors reserved for festivals, but in simple, honest homespun cloth, the everyday clothing of the village women who had lived and suffered silently for centuries. She tied her hair back and set out for the square. Word spread quickly. Curious faces peered from doorways and windows. A small crowd gathered, first in twos and threes, then in dozens. Men with crossed arms and suspicious eyes. Women clutching their shawls close. Children darting through the crowd, wide-eyed and whispering. Eliza stepped onto the old stone well at the center of the square, the same place where the elders had once given speeches about duty and obedience, about the sacredness of tradition. She stood tall and proud, the morning sun casting a golden halo around her. At first there was only silence. But she waited, heart pounding, until enough eyes turned toward her, until enough people were listening. "My name is Eliza Wren," she began, her voice carrying over the square. "And I was forced into a marriage I did not choose." A murmur ran through the crowd, sharp and startled. "I was told it was my duty. I was told it was for the good of the village. But what they really wanted was control. To silence me. To make me another obedient wife, another girl who never dared to dream of anything better." She scanned the faces before her. Some were hostile, some curious, some openly frightened. But among them here and there she saw younger faces, faces filled with something else, hunger. "Hope. I stand here today to say, enough." The words seemed to echo against the stone walls. Enough of forced marriages. Enough of choosing fear over kindness. Enough of allowing the few to rule the many through lies and cruelty. A voice from the crowd, a man's, called out, "And what would you have us do? Tear down everything our fathers built?" Eliza turned toward him, unflinching. "I would have us build something better." Another voice, this one younger, uncertain. "But how?" Eliza's voice softened. "By listening. By choosing. By standing together instead of cowering alone. The elders' power is not magic. It's fear. And fear only rules if we let it." A ripple moved through the crowd. The blacksmith's daughter, just 16, fierce and bright-eyed, stepped forward. Then the miller's son. Then another. A handful at first, barely a dozen among the sea of faces, but it was enough. They formed a loose, protective circle around Eliza, a physical declaration of allegiance. The elders stood apart, pale with rage and helplessness. The village was changing, right there before everyone's eyes. It would not happen overnight. Eliza knew that. There would be backlash. There would be cruelty. Some would cling to the old ways with bloody hands if they had to. But the spell was broken. The silence was broken. And once broken, it could never be restored. Eliza raised her chin, meeting the morning with unshakable resolve. She had dreamed of escape once, of slipping away quietly to some distant, better world. Now she realized she didn't have to run. She could fight. She could build. Right here. For herself. For the girls who would come after her. For the future this village had tried so hard to bury. The first brick had been thrown. Now it was time to tear down the wall. In the weeks following Eliza's public stand, the village moved through stages of confusion, anger, fear, and then slowly something else, awakening. The elders tried to tighten their grip at first. They issued harsh warnings from the pulpit, muttered dark threats about curses and divine punishment. They tried to rally the older villagers, the ones most invested in keeping things the same. But it was too late. The younger generation had tasted a different kind of power, the kind that came from standing together, and they would not go quietly back to their chains. It began subtly. A handful of families withdrew their daughters from arranged marriage agreements, citing illness or unsuitable matches. A few parents, once too afraid to question the elders, suddenly found the courage to say no. Then louder acts of rebellion followed. One girl, no more than 15, stood in the middle of the village square and refused to marry the 50-year-old widower chosen for her. Her parents tried to drag her home, but the crowd, inspired by Eliza's earlier speech, stepped in to shield her. A week later, 2 young lovers who had been forbidden to marry eloped under cover of darkness. When they returned hand in hand, the village, still reeling from all the change, had no strength left to punish them. Tradition still held in some hearts, but it was no longer law. It was choice. And that made all the difference. The elders' power crumbled like a rotted tree, hollowed out from the inside. Some resigned in disgrace. Others faded into the background, powerless and bitter. A few, facing public anger for their past abuses, fled the village altogether. Eliza watched it all unfold with a mixture of wonder and grim satisfaction. She had no illusions that the village would become a perfect place overnight. Change was slow, often painful. There were still bitter arguments in the marketplace, sharp whispers behind closed doors. Some old wounds would take years to heal. But the foundation had cracked. The seeds of something new were sown. And through it all, Samuel was at her side. Their relationship was a strange, fragile thing, still forming in the aftermath of everything that had happened. They had been thrown together by deception and necessity. Now they faced the more difficult task of choosing, freely, what they would be to each other. In the beginning there was awkwardness. Eliza sometimes caught herself flinching from Samuel out of old habit, only to remember that he had never truly been the monster she feared. And Samuel, for his part, struggled to shed the persona he had worn for so long. They spoke little of the past at first, preferring to work side by side in rebuilding their small home, tending a modest garden, mending fences. Slowly, trust grew where suspicion once lived. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant gold over the hills, Samuel found her sitting outside, weaving a basket from reeds. He sat beside her, silent for a long moment. Finally he said, "I never expected to have this." Eliza looked at him sideways. "This? A chance?" he said simply. "A real one." She smiled, small, tentative but real. "Neither did I." They said no more that night, but something shifted between them, soft and unseen like the turning of a season. Love was not guaranteed. Neither of them were so naive as to believe that affection would bloom simply because circumstance had thrown them together. But there was respect. There was honesty. And for the first time, there was freedom to choose what path they would walk, together or apart. It was more than most people in the village had ever dared to hope for. It was enough for now. The village itself, scarred but stirring with new life, reflected that same uncertain hope. The old ways were not gone entirely, but they were no longer absolute. The people had seen behind the curtain. They had witnessed what courage could do, how a single voice refusing to bow could shake the very ground. In years to come, the story of Eliza Wren would be told again and again. Some would call her a troublemaker. Others would call her a savior. But among the young, those with dreams bigger than the fields and hills that hemmed them in, she would be something more. A symbol. A reminder that the world did not have to be the way it had always been. It could be changed. It could be made new. And it had all started with one girl who said enough. Standing at the edge of the village, where the worn dirt road disappeared into the rolling hills, Eliza Wren could hardly recognize the place she had once called a prison. The same thatched cottages stood in their familiar rows, and the same church bell chimed from the steeple each morning. Children still raced through the narrow lanes, laughing and shouting. The fields still waved golden in the summer breeze. On the surface not much had changed. But beneath the surface, everything had. Eliza had changed most of all. She thought back to the girl she had been not so long ago, a girl trapped by expectations, weighed down by duty, terrified of stepping out of line. A girl who had been handed over like a parcel to a man the village scorned. A girl who had wept in secret, believing herself powerless. She hardly knew that girl now. Through fire, fear, and betrayal, Eliza had been forged into something stronger. She had spoken when silence had been demanded. She had stood tall when every instinct screamed at her to shrink. She had seized the reins of her own life and in doing so, had shaken an entire community awake. Her journey from victim to victor had not been neat or painless. It had been messy, raw, and imperfect. There were still nights when she woke in a sweat, memories of old fears clinging to her skin. There were still moments when doubt crept in, whispering that she was too small, too alone, too different. But she had learned that courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was acting despite fear. Tradition, she realized, was a powerful force, but it was not sacred. It could be questioned. It could be changed. It could be discarded when it no longer served justice or compassion. The village had learned that too in its own slow, stubborn way. It had not been easy. There had been arguments, heartbreak, even violence as the old ways fought to survive. Some families left rather than face a world they no longer understood. Some clung more tightly to the crumbling rituals, desperate for the false comfort of certainty. But others, especially the young, embraced the change. Girls who once accepted whatever fate was handed to them now dared to dream. They learned to read, to trade, to speak their minds. Boys learned that strength was not measured in domination but in integrity. Marriages became partnerships, not transactions. Families grew not just by blood but by choice and respect. It was a beginning. A fragile one, yes, but a beginning nonetheless. As for Samuel and Eliza, their path was equally uncharted. They remained together, bound not by the expectations of others but by a growing, cautious partnership built on shared history and mutual respect. Love, when it came slowly and without guarantees. It was built in quiet conversations over evening fires, in long days spent repairing the village's broken bridges, both literal and figurative. Samuel, once written off as the village drunk, had found a second life as well. He became a kind of folk hero among the younger villagers, a symbol of quiet rebellion and unexpected redemption. He still bore scars from his years of playing the fool, from the loneliness and self-loathing that had nearly swallowed him whole. But with Eliza, and with the new generation watching and learning, he found a purpose far greater than any he had dared imagine. They were not perfect people. They were simply people who had refused to be trapped by the worst parts of their world. And that, Eliza believed, was enough. One bright morning, nearly a year after her wedding day, Eliza stood at the well where she had once made her stand. Children gathered around her, listening intently as she spoke, not preaching, not commanding, but sharing stories, answering questions, asking them their dreams. One little girl, no more than 8, tugged at Eliza's hand. "Miss Eliza," she said shyly, "can I be whatever I want when I grow up?" Eliza knelt down to meet the girl's wide, hopeful eyes. "You already are," she said, smiling. And in that moment, Eliza understood something powerful. Change was never about grand gestures alone. It was about the small, everyday acts of courage. The conversations that planted seeds. The quiet moments when someone dared to believe in a different future. It was about refusing to let the past dictate the shape of the future. It was about choosing, again and again, to hope. Eliza stood and looked out across the square, the same place where fear had once ruled. Now she saw promise, movement, life. A place still imperfect, still growing, but finally, blessedly alive with possibility. She thought of the women who had come before her, those whose names had been forgotten, who had bent under the weight of traditions too heavy to bear. She honored their struggles by making sure their daughters would have another choice. She thought of the women who would come after her, bolder, freer, braver because of the path now open before them. She thought of herself, not as a victim shaped by the cruelty of others, but as a builder, a breaker of chains, a dreamer who had dared to turn sorrow into strength. Eliza Wren was no longer just a girl from a forgotten village trapped in time. She was a force. And the world would be different because of her. Hope, Eliza realized, was not a fragile thing. Hope was a sword. And she had learned how to wield it. With a final glance at the gathering crowd, Eliza smiled, turned toward the path home, and walked into the future she had carved for herself, step by steady step, unafraid.